Please take a seat. We'd like to start. It's such a wonderful program. There will be a 10-minute break halfway through, so a chance to refill your snacks and speak a little louder, I'm told. Okay, welcome. We're going to begin. My name is Judith Farber-Weissman, and Linda Levine and myself run the Community of Engagement, formerly the Community of Elders. I was so young when we started. See what happens when you grow old. Very happy and grateful that you're here today with us, and grateful for Leo Beck Temple and our community, because during these times, any times, good times and not, having a community, whether it's a club or a temple or a church, is really, we do ourselves a favor so we don't feel alone. And we make friends along the way, good friends. So I'm very happy to introduce the person who really was the contact person for Steve today and for our wonderful program, who really did yeoman's work and is on the steering committee with all of us, Suzanne Bauman. Come.
Hi, it's great to see everybody here. It really, my friends and temple friends and non-temple friends. Anyway, part of the reason Steve's here is that my husband and I would say we're groupies of our Steve Barri groupies, and that there are some other groupies here of Steve's. That we just take any class that we find out that he's teaching. Steve is a successful music producer and can you hear? Okay, better. Steve is a successful music producer and songwriter in his own right, and a very popular teacher at UCLA's Osher program and the Skirball and many other venues. Steve was born in 1942 in Brooklyn, and so you can, we know if we're older or younger. He moved to California in the 50s, and he began writing songs in his mid-teens, and soon paired up with another transplanted New Yorker, a singer-songwriter named P.F. Sloan. Together, Steve and P.F. wrote Barry McGuire's big hit, "Eve of Destruction." Some of us are a little older to have that been in our dancing or adolescent days, but I know it was a very famous song, which went to the top of the charts. That partnership ended in the 60s when Sloan returned to New York. Then Steve's reputation as a music producer became established, with clients such as Mama Cass and the Four Tops, as well as connections with Motown. Steve will share his vast knowledge of music and the industry with us this afternoon as we enjoy, from ragtime to rock and roll, the history of popular music. And I must give a shout out. Julie, where are you? Maybe she's in the restroom. I don't know. Steve's life partner and business partner, without whom none of this would be possible. Steve's the show, but Judy's the power behind the throne. So, Julie, thank you, and on with the show.
So good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear okay? Is it loud enough? Okay. The next thing we'll test is when we play the videos, but I guess this is working okay. Good. So I see some familiar faces here. So some of you know that I do these various lectures on rock and roll, the history of rock and roll. In the 50s, the 60s, I do a course on the Brill Building, the history of the Brill Building. I did a little bit of that here last year. I do a course on the singers-songwriters of the 70s, Motown to the Beatles. I do courses on the great songwriters of the Broadway's golden age. You'll even be hearing some Broadway songs today, as well as the great songwriters and the singers of the Great American Songbook. And these courses that I do are usually done over the course of 6 to sometimes 7 weeks, and they're 2 hours per course. So, obviously it takes quite a while. So it's always difficult when I'm asked to do something that I can get done in maybe 2 hours. I never know what to take from to condense something to do a 2-hour course. So what I decided to do for this one is I just went crazy. I decided to take bits and pieces of many courses that I do and kind of put this into one. Basically what you're going to hear over the next, almost 2 hours, I guess, with a little break in the middle, will be the highlights of about 150 hours worth of music history in less than 2 hours. So that's what we're going to be doing. So here we go. In the second half of the 19th century, American songs underwent this tremendous commercial expansion, so to speak. Initially, sheet music was the way people were able to buy or bring music into their homes. Sheet music was something that people had pianos in their homes. They could bring it in, they could play the piano, and that's the way Americans got to sing music in their own homes, and it was a way of bringing music into their lives. By the 1880s, the music publishing industry was increasingly concentrated in New York City, in a famous area called Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was the name given to this collection of buildings located on West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And by 1890, the songs that you bought could be sold. They were preserved, and a succession of new media ways of starting to now have sound recordings and player pianos where you had this round thing you can put into a piano and it would play the song. You didn't even have to play it yourself at that point. By the 1920s, we had radio and movie soundtracks, and of course, by the 50s, we had television as a way to expose new songs to the public. So, as I said, it would take hours and hours to tell this entire story. So for today, I'm going to focus basically on the American popular song between the years of 1911 and then going into the 70s with the singer-songwriters of the 70s. The reason I always start with 1911 is, believe it or not, that was the time that Irving Berlin wrote a song that is still considered to be the breakthrough song in the history of popular music. Up until this point in time, most of the music that we would listen to, or most of the music that people would sing or whatever, had all come from Europe, from operettas, or maybe someone like Stephen Foster that was doing folk songs. But basically, it was European kind of music. So in 1911, Irving Berlin writes what turns out to be the biggest hit song ever to that point in time. And what he managed to do was he managed to do something that was new. He combined his knowledge of these European melodies and harmonies with traditional African-American rhythms. So the song he wrote was Alexander's Ragtime Band, and it was a tremendous hit. And up until this song, ragtime music was only known in New Orleans and the black communities. This was thanks in part to an African-American composer, a great composer by the name of Scott Joplin, who was known to be the king of ragtime. So what Irving Berlin wrote in this song, which, by the way, wasn't even the ragtime rhythm. It was just talking about ragtime, but it did have a rhythm to it that no other song had to that point till that point in time. And in the lyric, he wrote, come on along, let me take you by the hand, up to the man, he's the leader of the band. It was basically an invitation to America, really, to come along on this journey to listen to this new kind of music. And not only did the nation come along, but ragtime music became a sensation, and it opened up a whole new way for songwriters to write it. It influenced almost everything that every songwriter was writing from that point on. One particular songwriter, a young songwriter, who, like Irving Berlin, was also the son of Jewish immigrant families, his name was George Gershwin. And Gershwin said, of Irving Berlin. He said that Irving Berlin was the very first to have created a real American music. By introducing and perfecting ragtime, he opened up a whole new world for all of us. By all of us, Gershwin was probably talking about Jerome Kern and Cole Porter and Harold Arlen and Rogers and Richard Rogers and Lorenz Hart and on and on, all those great songwriters. And when I do my courses on the Great American Songbook, I talk about all of them because they wrote all these incredible standards. But for today, in this first video clip that we're going to look at, it's going to focus primarily on Irving Berlin and on George Gershwin because we can't get them all in. At this time in America, there was a variety of different kinds of music becoming popular. Songs that had once been restricted to ethnic minorities or immigrant groups were now being marketed by the music industry to the entire nation. So what you had was, you had songs, Irish songs like Danny Boy or My Wild Irish Rose all of a sudden becoming hits. Italian songs like O Sole Mio becoming popular with all Americans. Jewish composers and performers likewise incorporated elements from their culture into American music. Artists like Sophie Tucker sang her big 1925 hit, My Yiddish Mama, in both English and Yiddish, and it was selling records to all Americans. We had the rise of a distinctive song style from the African-American community, ragtime music, blues, and later rhythm and blues. These were all coming out of the African-American, out of the black community, and white performers and audiences were now latching onto this music the same way they did when rock and roll first came around. The songwriters of the time listened to each other's music, and they learned from each other, and they created new styles out of what they were hearing. It would cross back and forth between things that somebody would hear and then add this, and then somebody would add that, and whatever, and that's how it all kind of snowballed to where it became this great American songbook. American popular music, as we know it, began this way. So this is a very eclectic look, as I say, of the history of popular music from ragtime to rock. So I'm going to begin with this first clip, and hopefully the sound will be good and all is working well. Here we go. We never know.
Every night you hear her croon a Russian lullaby.
It was Tsarist Russia that was unintentionally responsible for the birth of the popular song.
My baby.
Its anti-Semitism and vicious pogroms forced millions of Jews to flee to America. Among those refugees were the parents of George Gershwin and the 4-year-old Izzy Berlin, Irving Berlin. Over the next 30 years, the creative tensions between Jewish immigrants and the music they encountered in their adopted homeland would inspire a new era of popular song.
I'm stepping out with my baby, can't go wrong, 'cause I'm in right. It's for sure, not for maybe, that I'm all dressed up tonight. Stepping out with my honey, can't be bad to feel so good. Never felt quite so sunny, and I keep on knocking wood.
Most Russian immigrants, like the Gershwins and Berlins, arrived in New York City not knowing a word of English. They settled in the Lower East Side among a kaleidoscope of nationalities.
because there were immigrants from so many other cultures, not just Jews, they were hearing the music of the Irish and the music of the Italians, the music, and so they, you know, they all combined.
One of the few black musicians who was appreciated across ethnic boundaries was Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime. Black dance rhythms swept New York. They came as a wake-up call to the young Jewish immigrants. Irving Berlin ran away from home to sell newspapers on the street and to turn their stories into songs. He called this new music by an old name, ragtime.
Come on and hear, Alexander's ragtime band. Come on and hear, it's the best band in the land. They can play a bugle call like you never heard before. So natural that you wanna go to war. That's just the best band what I am. Oh, my honey lamb, come on along, let me take you by the hand. Up to the man, who's the leader?
You see, back then in the 1910s, ragtime was the rock and roll of its period. Young people danced to it. It was the music of the skyscraper. It was the music of modern America.
The hue and cry about ragtime, of course, was largely tinged with anti-black racism. Its jungle rhythms are forever being maligned. But also, there's a strain of anti-Semitism there because they're talking about sort of the Jewish song merchants who are pushing this horrible jungle music on America's youth.
So vaudeville theatres became a bizarre melting pot where black performers had to caricature themselves and black up as minstrels. In fact, there were Jewish singers who even pretended they were black. Al Jolson, immigrant son of a Lithuanian rabbi, became America's top star by blacking up as a minstrel. One of his biggest blackface hits was a song by George Gershwin.
Swanee sounds like it could have been written for a Yiddish musical on the Lower East Side. Even the introduction in the music is a traditional introduction used in a lot of Yiddish theater songs. It's Jewish. I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Da 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 dee dee.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks here. D-I-X, I even know my mammies waiting for me, praying for me down by the Swanee. The folks up north won't see me no more when I get to that Swanee shore.
Swanee was the first hit tune of the young George Gershwin. It was written in a section of New York, named after the sound made by so many songs being auditioned all at once, Tin Pan Alley.
And so they were out to deliberately create hits. That's what Tin Pan Alley physically was and what it mentally is. It's a state of mind of commercialized popular music.
And on the other side, there's another Gershwin tune.
I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. I'm going to get there at any price. Stand aside, I'm on my way. I've got the blues on up above, it's so fair. Shoes gone and carry me there. I'll build a stairway to paradise with a new step every day. With a new step every time.
So to quote Tony Bennett, when he was once asked, how the American songbook came to be, he said, if it wasn't for African Americans and Jews, there would be no American songbook. I mean, it basically, the responsibility for the kind of music that became popular because of so many Jewish songwriters and combining the music from the Jewish, Italian, all those neighborhoods to what was happening in the black communities, including the kind of rhythms that they were involved in creating at the time. So we'll wait till somebody can shut their phone off. Okay, so now, in the 1940s, many of the hit songs of the day came from Broadway revues. During the first half of the 1950s, many of the pop hits of the day, the big hits, were coming from motion pictures. Most of the pop hits were on major labels. The major labels were RCA, Mercury, Decca, Capitol, and of course, Columbia, which was like kind of maybe the Rolls Royce of record labels at the time. The man responsible for many of Columbia's hits in the 50s was Mitch Miller. Now, Mitch Miller was born July 4th, 1911, the same year that Berlin wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band. He was the head of A&R at Columbia Records, one of the most important and influential and powerful figures in American popular music during the 50s and the 60s. A&R, by the way, basically what I was for most of my career, stands for Artist and Repertoire. So it's your job to basically find artists assigned to the label and then to find the songs for them to sing, because back in those days, the artists didn't write their own songs for the most part. They needed songwriters to write their songs. Mitch Miller was responsible for recording artists like Joe Stafford, Doris Day, Dinah Shore, Frank Sinatra, and they were all on the label actually when he first came to the label. And he was also personally responsible for signing some young people that he signed to the label: Tony Bennett, Johnny Mathis, Rosemary Clooney, Guy Mitchell, and a couple of instrumental artists, Percy Faith and Ray Conner. Great talents. Miller loved novelty songs. Frank Sinatra hated novelty songs, and he was asked by Mitch Miller at one point to do a record. Sinatra wasn't selling records that much anymore. So Miller had him record a song called Mama Will Bark and the Hucklebuck, which failed, and Sinatra was so upset with having to record that he left the label. He hated Mitch Miller. Rosemary Clooney never liked singing some of the songs Mitch Miller wanted her to sing, because he wanted her to sing these songs with an Italian kind of accent. But the songs like Come On to My House and Mambo Italiano, they became #1 million sellers for her, so she went along with it. Some of the artists that Miller signed also are looked on now as kind of pioneers of the change of music that music made in the 50s, the change from the crooner to rock and roll. Two of these artists one was Frankie Lane in particular. He was quite different from the other artists because he was heavily influenced by black singers, and also he's a big fan of jazz music. But Mitch Miller had another direction for Frankie Lane, who he also had when he was at Mercury Records. So he had signed him to Columbia. And he asked Frankie Lane to sing a song that Frankie Lane hated, a song called Mule Train. And Frankie Lane said, "What has that got to do with my music, with jazz? You know, people are going to laugh at." And Mitch Miller said, "Yeah, but you'll find new people, wanting to buy your records now." So he sang, and of course he had a #1 hit. Jezebel was another song that he brought to him. Miller's selection of songs for Frankie Lane was different from the songs that the crooners of the day were singing. They were much more emotional, much more unusual, much more soulful. But the bottom line was they were very, very big hits. Another Mitch Miller signing was a singer that was even more over the top and emotional than Frankie Lane, and that was Johnny Ray. I know Dan Davis is here, one of his all-time favorites, Johnny Ray. Every time I mention Johnny Ray, Dan says, "I love that guy." So anyway, Johnny Ray, as early as 1952, Johnny Ray had a record that he put out, and both sides of the record, this was so unusual back then, both sides of the records went to #1. One side was called The Little White Cloud That Cried, and the other side was just called Cry. And between the two of them, they sold like 2 million copies. And Johnny Ray, he became kind of a sensation with the Bobby Soxers, with the young girls. And for a while, he was like the heartthrob. everybody would talk about Johnny Ray in that day as the bridge between Frank Sinatra and the Bobby Soxers that he had and Elvis Presley. So Johnny Ray was kind of in between that. And it was also the first time that a white artist had both sides of his record go to number one on the R&B charts. So that was very, very unusual. Another of the groundbreaking artists in the business at the time was Les Paul, another groundbreaker in popular music. He was a great guitar player, and along with his wife, Mary Ford, he had this incredible string of top 10 records. But even more than that, he was an inventor, a genius. First of all, he invented the solid block electric guitar. So there was no such thing as an electric guitar before Les Paul. So he made it so that you didn't just have to put a microphone in front of an acoustic guitar. Now you can plug directly into an amplifier and play rock and roll. You could play as loud as you want and blow people's ears off. It was an amazing moment. He also invented multi-track recording. For the first time ever, he came up with a way to put an extra record head on a tape recorder. So he and his wife could, let's say, record. She could sing, he could play a guitar, and then they could put on earphones, listen back, and then record on top of that, which is commonplace now, but back then it was never done before. All of the records that, if you remember any of the Les Paul and Mary Ford records, only 2 people ever played on those records. He played all the guitar parts, all the bass part, everything, and she sang all the harmonies and everything. He came up with that invention. Folk music was also being accepted at pop radio stations in the 50s. The Weavers had the first, they were like the first folk group, I guess, that became very popular, had a string of hits. And they were the kind of the inspiration for groups like the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary later on. All of the early 50s songs, all of the hits during that time, and there were many of them, they had great singers and great songwriters, as the previous decades had. However, if you were young enough to be looking for something new at this particular time in the 50s, it was starting to happen. It wouldn't really have its big, its big moment, maybe until 1955. But things were definitely starting to change. It was quite clear. Along with the more traditional hits, there were these records with new singers and this new style. There were new sounding songs along with new, interesting, edgier sounding records that were used. A lot of it really had to do with Mitch Miller's vision of what a record should sound like. Mitch Miller believed that a record, that you could buy sheet music, let's say, and bring a song into your home and play it on the piano. But if we're talking about something like Mule Train or something like that, you couldn't really play that at home because it was the sound of the whip, the sound of the horseback. So he wanted to have these records sound so that every record had an individual sound, and you couldn't play it in your house and be happy with it. You had to go out and buy the record. That was his vision, and it was working to a certain degree. The funny thing about all of this is that Mitch Miller hated rock and roll when it finally surfaced, and yet everyone believes that he was one of the visionaries most responsible for rock and roll without even knowing what he was doing at the time. So the early 50s presented us with an eclectic mix of traditional sounding ballads by older singers along with these newer sounding novelty records. It also gave us more experimental sounding records, an interesting new provocative and progressive kind of singers like Frankie Lane, Kay Starr, Johnny Ray, Teresa Brew, and others. So here's kind of a look at the first half, the early part of the 1950s.
Of the successful songs of the early 50s is that they're written by Tin Pan Alley veterans. It is almost a dumbing down of the kind of skills that seemed called upon in the most successful and the most lauded
of the earlier popular music associated with Tin Pan Alleys.
The old Tin Pan Alley certainties of quality songs for quality singers was no longer generating enough sales for the record companies. Enter Mitch Miller, the first of a new breed we now call the record producer.
What I was thinking, I want to make the picture alive through the listener's ear. You wanted to catch their ear in the first 4 bars. So that somebody liked it enough so that they wanted to buy it. And to buy it, they meant to play it over and over again.
All up along, the focus was on the song itself. And in the 1920s, say, if My Blue Heaven was the big hit, you might have bought the record, but chances are you bought the sheet music and you went home and played it on your piano. And if you were a lousy piano player, you could still essentially get, My Blue Heaven in your home, played by you on your piano. Whereas by the time of something like Mule Train, anything you could do on the piano would just be, ridiculous.
Mule train, clearly clapping over hill and plain. Seems as how they never stop. Clippity clop, clippity clop, clippity 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 clapping along. Come on to my house, I'm gonna give you candy. Come on to my house, I'm gonna give you apple, a plum, and a
When I did Come On to My House, I heard it on an obscure label in a wholly different version. And it gave me the idea to do it with Rosemary Clooney with a harpsichord.
Turn up, turn up, turn up, turn up, can't you hear the music playing in the city square? Turn up, turn up, turn up, turn up, come where all our friends will find us with the dancers there. Stand up, come and dance the horror. 1, 2, 3, 4. All the boys will envy me for stand up. When the band is playing, my heart sings. Stand up, stand up, stand up.
Mona Lisa, men have named you. You're so like the lady with the mystic smile.
I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake, baked a cake, baked a cake. If I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. How'd you do, how'd you do, how'd you do? Dabba 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 dabba, said the chimpy to the monk. Dabba 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 dabba, said the monkey to the chimp. All night long they'd chatter away, all day long they were happy and gay, swinging and singing in the honky-tonky way.
Wheel of Fortune, oh, spinning around.
Anytime you're feeling lonely, anytime you're feeling blue,
See the pyramids along the Nile. Watch the sunrise on a tropic isle. But just remember, darling, all the while, you belong to me.
Number 1, the top tune of the week. The song the survey finds in first place. Vaya con Dios.
Now the hacienda's dark, the town is sleeping. Now the time has come to part, the time for weeping. Vaya con Dios, my darling. Vaya con Dios, my love.
How much is that doggy in the window? The one with the waggly tail. How much is that doggy in the window? I do hope that dog is for sale.
when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore. When the world seems to shine like you've had too much wine, that's amore.
Don't you know that it's worth every treasure on earth? If you're young at heart are, it's much better by far to be young at heart.
That little white cloud that sat right down
That's what we were listening to, folks. That's what we were buying. So all these interesting kind of things, these songs, all these artists, the novelty songs, the progressive sounding songs, that's what the radio stations, the pop radio stations were playing. Then in 1954, something started to change a bit. Many of the biggest hits of that year were called cover records. Cover records were hit songs recorded by white artists that had already been hits by black artists, but only heard on black radio stations for a period of time in the black neighborhoods. Top 40 radio stations wouldn't play them. Cover records could also, if, let's say, Frank Sinatra records Young at Heart and then Tony Bennett does a version of it, that's a cover record too. But back then, cover records were considered these white records becoming hits by white artists that were cover records of black artists. Number one hits like Sincerely by the McGuire Sisters would sell 1 million records, while the original version of that same song by a black group called the Moonglows would sell maybe, a few 100,000, let's say. And this was because most white record buyers never got to hear the original music because those records weren't played on top 40 radio stations because of the unwillingness for these radio stations to play black artists unless the record started to explode and they had to play it. That's how bad things were at that time. Two other examples was a song like Tweedledee, which was a smash for an artist by the name of Georgia Gibbs, who was about 35 years old. She had nothing to do with rock and roll. It was a cover of a song that Laverne Baker had that was a big hit. And of course, Ain't That a Shame and Tutti Frutti were big hits by Pat Boone, and everybody thought, wow, this Pat Boone guy is inventing this new rock and roll. No, he was covering records by Little Richard and by Fats Domino. That had already been hits. In 1954, the biggest hit for the entire year was another one of these cover records. It was a song by a white group called the Crew Cuts, and the song was called Shaboom. And it already had been a number one hit by a group called the Crows that was already a big hit about 6 months before and played on these black radio stations. Even though many of these white cover versions would become big hits, they did become big hits, they were never as good, or they never had the same vitality or the same excitement or the same soul that these original records had. We didn't know that until we got to hear the originals. But at that point, very few of us were listening or able to hear the originals. In 1955, it was clear that the fix was in. Music was changing. Young people, teenagers, were now becoming a major force in the sales of popular records. The market was getting younger. Teenagers were looking for more interesting, new-sounding records to buy, new-sounding artists. That same year, a movie, 1955, a movie came out that was directed by a director by the name of Richard Brooks. And he used a record over the credits of that movie, a record that was out a year early in 1954, and used that over the credits of the movie. The movie was called Blackbird Jungle. And when the record was first released, this record that he decided to use, it didn't do very well in 1954. But now in 1955, this record, Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets, would become a worldwide sensation. It seemed like it happened overnight. And rock and roll just happened overnight. Anyway, that's the way it seemed. Rock Around the Clock hit number one in July of 1955. Most people thought that, well, okay, that was the year. That's when rock and roll was born. But to be honest, rock and roll records didn't really dominate the charts from that point on. It actually took a while before the next real rock and roll moment would happen. And the next one really wouldn't happen until May of 1956, and that was Elvis Presley and Heartbreak Hotel. And that was really like, from that point on, it was pretty much over, although most of the other hits, really, that came between Rock Around the Clock and Heartbreak Hotel, songs like Love is a Many Splendid Thing, Autumn Leaves, The Yellow Rose of Texas. I mean, these were not exactly rock and roll standards. Rock and roll music, rockabilly music, rhythm and blues, doo-wop music, they really were starting to take hold. By the way, doo-wop music, which was really just nothing more than vocal harmony music, it was never called doo-wop until, I think, the 70s. Anyway, that was starting to take hold. Most of the early rock and roll records being played were by black artists. And at first, they were only being played on these black radio stations. In fact, these stations that played them, these records were called race records at the time. They had their separate chart and everything. But now, early rock and roll records were starting to be played on pop stations as well. And all teenagers of all colors were starting to discover this music that we fell in love with because of this great beat. The second half of the 50s was an amazing time in the country. We had recently come out of a war. New businesses and homes were being built. People were moving from the cities to the suburbs. The economy was growing. It was a new crop of teenagers coming of age. It was an optimistic time for most in the country. For me, it was one of the greatest years of all time because the Brooklyn Dodgers finally won a World Series in 1955. Unfortunately, my parents decided to move west. We moved out of Brooklyn in 1954, so I never got to get even with all those Yankee and Giant fans. But I'm happy now, anyway, after this year. Most homes already had televisions, and our parents, the adults, they were glued to their television sets at night. And instead of listening to their favorite radio programs like the Jack Benny program, or Burns and Allen's, Bob Hope, whatever, they were now watching these shows on these huge 10-inch television sets we had at home. So radio was really losing its audience to television. And they turned to the least expensive programming that they could find, which was music. One disc jockey would play a bunch of records, and that was the way to go. Teenagers would be listening to the radios before they went to bed at night. The music that they were starting to hear was something new and exciting, and they were liking what they were hearing. Teenagers were becoming a separate commercial unit away from their parents. Records and movies became the way to hear new rock music, and it was really starting to take over. So this next clip that you're going to see is a collage of songs, artists, and moments that kind of will give you a feel of how things were changing during the second half of the 50s, and you'll see the effect that young people were having basically on everything that was going on in the country. Music historians talk about two major events in pop music history that were called pop explosions. A pop explosion meaning that a certain artist or a certain song would come out and it would change the way everybody would dress and look and act or whatever. You'd cut your hair longer or whatever. The second one came in 1964 when the Beatles and the British invasion happened. And the first one took place in 1956, and that's when Elvis Presley exploded on the rock and roll scene. But if you look back, it was 1954 really that this record Shaboom by the Crew Cuts became the number one record for the entire year. And at that moment, there was a feeling within the record community, within the music community, that things were really starting to change.
Life could be a dream, life could be a dream. Shaboom. Life could be a dream. If I could take you up in paradise up above. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream, sweetheart.
Life could be a dream, sweetheart. Shaboom, shaboom.
The time had come for a white performer who could adapt rhythm and blues without losing its vitality.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me, honey. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock.
Rock Around the Clock was just a moderate success when first released in 1954. But its subsequent choice as the theme song for the movie Blackboard Jungle not only made the song the year's biggest hit, but catapulted Bill Haley and rock and roll to national attention.
to go. And go it does at KWK. We're all through playing rock and roll records.
This rock and roll rhythm is filled with dynamite, and we don't want the dynamite to go off in the Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City.
Well, if you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
Oh, till the body baby diamond ring. If that diamond ring don't shine. Oh, then the dig it to a private eye.
Tweedly, 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 dee. I'm as happy as can be.
Tell your mama, tell your pa, I'm gonna send you back to Arkansas. Oh, yes, ma'am. You don't do it right.
Found my thrill. Oh, blueberry.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender. Pretending that I'm doing well.
Elvis, how can I get these girls to scream over me this way? I really mean that. How can I do that?
Mr. Brewer, I don't think you like it.
I wouldn't like one. What do you mean?
No, I mean, I don't like it. All these girls screaming, always taking your clothes off, and always, trying to rip you apart, and always trying to kiss you. I don't like it.
You don't? Someone must have stomped on his head with those blue suede shoes.
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at the end of Lonely Street at Heartbreak Hotel. I'll be so lonely, baby. Well, I'm so lonely. I'll be so lonely I could die.
Well, the papers reported that you were greeted with silence over there and with catcalls from the audience. Is that right?
Well, I can't agree with them there, sir. Our audience was very nice and very good.
Were you there, Mrs. Lewis? At this?
I was there, but I wasn't at the show.
Come on over, baby. Whole lot of shaking going on. Yes, I said, come on over, baby. Baby, you can't go wrong. Come along and beat my party down. Come along and beat my party down. Come along and beat my party down. I'll make love to you. Bye bye love. Bye bye happiness. Hello loneliness. I think I'm gonna cry.
Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe. Well, that'll be the day when you say goodbye. Yes, that'll be the day when you make me cry. You say you're gonna leave, you know it's a lie, 'cause that'll be the day when I die.
Bee-bop-a-loo-ba. She's my baby. Bee-bop-a-loo-ba. I don't mean maybe.
Bebop-a-lula, she's my baby. Bebop-a-lula, I don't mean maybe.
Well, love, lovey, darling, come and go with me. Don't let me, baby, under these tears on my pillow. Pain in my heart caused by you.
What's your honest opinion of rock and roll?
Well, I'm not a good one to ask. Your father and I have been pretty well brainwashed by now, so I can at least stay in the same room with him.
I'm walking, yes indeed I'm talking for you and me, and I'm hoping that you come back to me.
Hello, baby.
Okay, so I got one more clip to play, and then we'll take a little break, okay? So in 1959, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper, who we just saw, they were all killed in an airplane crash, as we know. In the famous song American Pie was called The Day the Music Dies. Elvis Presley was in the Army at the time. Jerry Lee Lewis had been banned from radio because he married his 13-year-old cousin. And it seemed like there was a void in rock and roll, and the artist and the music had kind of lost the edge that it had when it first began. Every weekday afternoon on American Bandstand, Dick Clark was presenting good-looking, clean-cut young singers like Fabian, Frankie Avalon, Bobby Rydell, and these latest teen idols. The final #1 record of the 50s was Mac the Knife by Bobby Darin. That was kind of a throwback to the big band era of the 40s and the 50s. As the 60s began, the country was still pretty upbeat about things. The economy was still growing. Teenagers were now a major financial force in the country. Music, movies, television shows, clothing, everything was being kind of aimed, catering to the younger teenage market. Musically, for the first time, or the first 3 years, I should say, of the 60s, it was a continuation of what had started toward the end of the 50s, which was a kind of a softening of pop music, of rock and roll music. It was transforming, really, from rock and roll into just pop music, just ordinary pop music, all different kinds of it. During the first 3 years of the 60s, there were only 3 important breakout artists that really had staying power. Roy Orbison in 1960, Four Seasons in 1961, and Peter Paul Mary in 1962. As the decade began, most of the biggest hits were being performed by artists that did not write their own songs. The hits were being written by professional songwriters like they had always been in the 30s and 40s. Only thing different is that these new songwriters were very young, and most of them grew up on the music of Berlin and Porter and Rodgers and Hart and whatever. Only now they were being influenced by these rock and roll records that they were hearing and by these new founders of rock and roll, the Fats Dominoes and the Chuck Berrys and whatever. Toward the end of the 50s and into the 60s, the Drifters, the Coasters, and Elvis, among others, they were having more hits than just about anybody else. All of their songs were being written by a young songwriting team of Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. When younger white songwriters like myself at the time, you know, when you saw that all of these hits, if you were into music and you look at the labels, that they were being written by these 2 white guys, all these hits for black artists, 2 white guys, 2 Jewish white guys, you know, from Los Angeles, you figured, geez, yeah, maybe this is something I could do. As the 60s began, the Brill Building in New York City became the home for some of the greatest of these young rock music songwriters in this ever-growing rock and roll world of popular music. Lieber and Stoller became mentors to many of these young music makers of the time. They, over a period of 3 to 4 years, they had over 200 hits over actually a 5-year period. Many of them performed by black artists like the Ronettes and the Coasters and the Shirelles and Benny King and the Crystals and the Drifters. Probably the most successful of the Brill Building publishing companies was a brand new entity called Alden Music. And the company was founded in 1958 by Al Nevins and Don Kirshner. And it was located, now the Brill Building itself was located at 1619 Broadway, but right next to it was another building where it wasn't as nice a building and it wasn't as expensive to rent office space there. So a lot of the new publishers began. That was at 1650 Broadway, but it was all the Brill Building area. Over the course of 5 years, Alden Music, this publishing company, would almost have as many hits as Motown did during their big hit period in the 60s. They did it primarily with 3 songwriting teams, Neil Sedaka and Howie Greenfield, Jerry Goffin and Carole King, Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, all, as they were called, the Jewish Kids from Brooklyn. They were all teenagers when they signed with Alden Music, 3 of the greatest pop songwriting teams really in rock history. Alden, during this short period of time, had more than 100 songs hit the Billboard record charts, many of them now considered classics. There was a story always going around. I mean, it was kind of a funny thing. In the record business, they would always say that Don Kirshner, who was the publisher, would get into a limousine and go into Brooklyn and drive around neighborhoods. And if he was seeing Jewish neighborhoods, any kids sitting around playing music, he would want to know if he could sign them. I mean, that's how it was becoming at that time. Another songwriter that was based out of the Brill Building was Phil Spector, who was not part of Alden Music. Phil, of course, had some early success here on the West Coast. He was a Fairfax High School alumni of mine, and he recorded a song with the Teddy Bears that became a #1 record called To Know Mr. Love 'Em. Lieber and Stoller co-wrote Spanish Harlem with Phil. And Phil would also go on to write some very big hits with Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann for groups like the Crystals and the Ronettes and the Righteous Brothers. They wrote one of the biggest songs in the history of popular music for the Righteous Brothers, which you'll hear in this next clip, You Lost That Love and Feeling. In 1963, get this now, Alden Music was sold to Screen Gems Columbia. It was sold for $3 million. Don Kirshner would become the head of its entire music division for movies, television, and records. A lot of us always believe that the only reason that Don Kirshner sold at that particular point in time is because he wanted the power of being involved with movies and television and all that other stuff. Because if he had waited a year, the company was, a year later, was worth $27 million. And if he would waited a little longer, eventually it was worth $800 million. So he sold way too soon and way too cheaply. Alden Music wasn't the only company making millions in publishing. There were others housed at the Brill Building. Some of the other great songwriters that wrote there were Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, Burt Bacharach and Hal David, Jeff Barry and Ellie Greenwich, and Neil Diamond was one of the Brill Building songwriters. Diamond started out as a songwriter, and he wrote a couple of hits for the Monkees at first, including I'm a Believer. And also, like Carole King and Neil Sedaka also became hit artists. They also started as songwriters there. So during its heyday, the Brill Building had brought a new professionalism and maturity to rock and roll records. The Brill Building writers, together with the original rock and rollers that they had supplanted, they really supplied the basis for pop music in much of the 60s. The early part, the Beatles and the English idolized these songwriters. We didn't know it because we didn't know what was going on there, but they idolized these people. In fact, some of the early Goffin and King songs are on the early Beatles albums. The Brill Building writers, Lieber and Stoller in particular, brought production techniques to rock and roll that had never been done before. They were the first to use violins and cellos and horns and kettle drums, all kinds of percussion to embellish their songs. Many rock historians look at the early part of the 60s until the Beatles arrived as a low point for rock and roll. I disagree, of course, because that's when I got started. But it was, it was these pre-Beatle years at the Brill Building. Songwriters were writing there, and they gave us some of the best pop and R&B songs truly ever written. So you'll see in this next clip and hear some of those songs, and then we'll take a little break.
This is the Brill Building. In the 1960s, teenagers wrote hit songs there, hundreds of them.
Call it beginning rock and roll.
The Brill Building sound.
We have all kinds of courage.
Musical and factory at the same time.
There was an atmosphere in the Brill Building that was so alive.
Burt Bacharach was the kid coming up.
All these kids, Goffin and King, Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry, were Jewish kids.
Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil.
Pomus and Schumann. They all came from Brooklyn.
Building and those 3 or 4 blocks surrounding it. Awesome.
Half a century ago, around an upright piano, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller began writing the standards of a new type of music that would be called rock and roll.
When the night has come and the land is dark.
The two creative people coming from different backgrounds, different schools, and into one pot. And they're in there bubbling all the time. They're great.
With the Drifters, soul music was rarely sweeter. And with the Coasters, rock music was never funnier.
Take out the papers and the trash.
Lieber Stoller writing that type of stuff that white kids and black kids like.
Jerry and Mike was so brilliant with chance taking
and stepping into new territories and don't give a damn about who think about it. Go for it and pow, there you are.
I held my nose, I closed my eyes, I took a drink.
As songwriters, their forte was rhythm and blues. They wrote some of the most authentic rhythm and blues that white Jewish guys ever wrote.
At 1650 Broadway, a young publisher called Don Kirshner had just opened the doors of Aldon Music to create a home for these new songwriters. The very first writing team to walk in was the 18-year-old Neil Sedaka and his lyricist, Howard Greenfield.
There was a certain drum beat, a certain guitar lick, the harmonic rhythm.
I love my calendar girl. Yeah, the sweet calendar girl. I love my calendar girl. Each and every day of the year.
While Dick Clark was putting on Fabian and Avalon and Bobby Rydell with all the great faces, and he was turning to the images, I was turning to the song, appealing to the universal kids all over America.
As a freshman at Queens College, Carole King had met a chemistry student named Jerry Goffin. Goffin and King quickly became partners in song and romance. Don Kirshner signed them for $50 a week and the promise of making them the biggest writers in the country. Goffin and King married in September of 1960. The following year, another union was born in the offices of Alden Music.
We always thought that we were the bridge between the old Tin Pan Alley and rock and roll.
Thomas had been writing the blues for Joe Turner and Ray Charles when rock music broke. He partnered with a teenager from Coney Island, Mort Schumann. Together they melded the blues with a bleached teen sensibility.
Each night I ask the stars up above, why must I be a teenager in love?
Together, Thomas and Schumann would write dozens of songs for Elvis Presley, as well as hits for Dion, Fabian, and Andy Williams. They also came up with many of the Drifters' most important songs, including their only #1 hit.
Cause don't forget who's taking you home, and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, save the last dance for me. Say the last dance for me. So won't you say you love me? I'll make you so proud of me. We'll make eternity ever even so we go. So won't you please be my little baby?
Okay, we'll take a little break and then continue.
The bathrooms, restrooms are out the double doors over here. 10 minutes, that's it.
All right, if everyone is ready to be seated, by the way, if anybody, has anybody lost a pair of sunglasses? Because we have them up here if you're missing a pair of sunglasses. What?
Say something again. We're trying.
Okay.
I don't think anybody heard you.
Okay. All right, everyone, if we're ready. Has anyone, if anyone is missing a pair of sunglasses, they're up here, by the way. Somebody left them. Are they yours? Okay. We have a winner. There you go. Okay, so we'll continue our very quick, abbreviated journey here of the great American songbook and popular music in general. So, all right, 1963, that's when Alden Music, the company, the publishing company was just told you about, sold way too early, but they sold to Screen Gems Columbia. This was part of the beginning of popular music's move to the West Coast. Movie studios, television production companies realized that big money was to be made in owning their own music. You know, they would be able to then use their own copyrights in motion pictures and TV shows that they were producing. Today, when any song, old songs I wrote or whatever, are used for a commercial or on some television show or in a movie, we make a fortune. It's incredible how much money they're willing to pay. But companies were also smart, and they said, well, let's own our own so we don't have to spend $50,000 just to use a little piece of a song in one of our films. So that was starting to happen. Another reason for the move west was that there were artists starting to become hits on the West Coast. The Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, the Ripcords, the Safaris, Dick Dale and the Deltones, other bands that were having these hit recordings from the West Coast. Basically, they were doing what were called surf songs or hot rod songs at the time. I know that well because I kind of got my start in 1963. I was singing background vocals on Jan and Dean records with Jan. We sang on Surf City and the Little Old Lady from Pasadena. We did the backgrounds and all the falsetto parts and whatever. My partner and I were also writing songs for Jan and Dean, and other West Coast artists too. We wrote for Johnny Rivers, Secret Agent Man, Mamas and Papas, The Grassroots, The Turtles, lots of other groups. The music was being called the West Coast Sound, and all of a sudden everything seemed to come to a halt when just as things seemed to be exploding. November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And for a few months, and basically through the entire Christmas season, I remember, it was a very depressed mood within the music industry. Nobody seemed to, to want to do anything or whatever. And there wasn't much happening. In fact, the biggest record, I think, at that particular time, to show you the kind of music that was being popular, was Dominique by the Singing Nun. That was the #1 record. Then, on February 9th, 1964, it was a Sunday night, 8 p.m., Ed Sullivan introduced the band from Liverpool, and it would change popular music from that point on. America was, I guess, looking for something to lift our spirits, and the Beatles were apparently what we needed. Sullivan, who had, hated rock and roll music, but he was smart enough to know that he should have, if he wanted to attract young viewers to his show, he would need young acts, and these rock and roll acts, which most of them he couldn't stand, but he signed them and put them on the show anyway. I could tell you stories about him, that are hysterical, but I don't have time to go into them all. But I will say that he heard about the Beatles having this tremendous, explosion in Europe, especially in of course, in London. And so they wanted to get, Brian Epstein, their manager, wanted to get them on the Ed Sullivan Show here, come to America if they ever had a hit record here, which they hadn't had yet. So he invited Ed Sullivan to come to England to see the Beatles. So Sullivan arrived at Heathrow Airport, but he was stuck on the plane. They couldn't let anybody out because they said the Beatles had just arrived from their tour of France, and there's 10,000 people out there, and we can't let anybody out until they clear the airport. He said at that point he realized something was going on. He didn't even have to hear them. He just signed them to these. So that's how clever he was. Rock and roll music would now have its second pop explosion. Rock and roll, it's kind of a reinventing of rock and roll. Suddenly America was introduced and invaded by these rock and roll bands from England. It was so-called the British invasion. Dave Clark Five, Herman's Hermits, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and of course the Rolling Stones. There were so many others at that particular time. The Beatles wrote most of their own songs, whereas most of the other British groups didn't. So many of the bands were doing remakes or older songs that some of us had written, and certainly a lot of Goffin and King songs that were written by American songwriters. My partner and I got very lucky. Our mentor and the guy that owned our publishing company, Lou Adler, was very friendly with the gentleman that produced Herman's Hermits, and Herman's Hermits was huge at the time, next to the Beatles. Well, anyway, the Beatles made a movie called A Hard Day's Night. It was a smash, and now the Herman's Hermits was going to make a movie. So we met with Mickey Most, who was the producer, and we went over some songs. He said, do you have anything that might be interesting, sounding like A Hard Day's Night, something positive, negative, whatever, something, that people would be confused about? So I looked through my little book. I always had a book of song titles, and I said, I got a song about a girl that, that guy really likes, but she's trouble, and everybody says that she's a must to avoid. This song is called A Must to Avoid. And he said, wow, perfect. That's the song. So they recorded that. We recorded 4 songs with them for this movie. What happened was that one afternoon we got a call saying that they just screened the movie for young kids to see what kind of reaction it would get. And the title of the movie, of course, was going to be A Must to Avoid. And so they said the screening was so bad, and the movie was so bad, they said they don't think it's going to do well, and they're afraid that critics will say a must to avoid is a must to avoid. So they said, we'll have to change the title. So luckily we had written another song called Hold On, and that wound up being the title of the movie. And the movie actually did very well. So now everyone in America was cutting their hair like the Beatles, wearing clothes like the Beatles, the boots and the footwear, everything. I even knew people, from Brooklyn that all of a sudden had British accents. So, I mean, it was a strange time in the country. At the same time, At the same time, an independent record label based out of Detroit, Michigan, was making an enormous impact on the music scene, Motown Records. And it would soon dominate the top 40 stations, along with the artists of the British invasion. Some of the Motown acts we all know, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Four Tops, Marvin Gaye, Martha and the Vandellas, and the 13-year-old genius by the name of Stevie Wonder. By the mid-'60s, the escalating unpopular war in Vietnam and the fight for civil rights were on the minds of most young people in the country. Many of the songs being written were now starting to reflect young people's concerns about what was going on in the world. And along comes a folk singer by the name of Bob Dylan, who became the voice of young America and the leader of folk music in the country, this folk music revival. His songs were more socially conscious and introspective than we had really been listening to or heard before. Dylan's songwriting had a big influence on the Beatles. The Beatles' songwriting and their electric guitar sound and whatever had a big influence on Bob Dylan. Eventually, Dylan switched from acoustic guitar to electric guitar. He did that at the Newport Folk Festival one day in 1965. And when he did it, he was booed off the stage. There's a movie coming out about Dylan. That'll probably be in there. It was a major moment. But he was now the leader of a new genre of music called folk rock music. And, I had my first #1 record with a Bob Dylan influence song that was written, honestly, 90% by my partner, Phil Sloan, a song called Eve of Destruction in 1965. It was recorded by Barry McGuire. My second #1 hit in the 60s was recorded by Johnny Rivers. And that's another strange story because basically we were asked to write just a short little song to be the title song of a new television show that was going to come on for the summer called Danger Man. And so my partner didn't want to have anything to do with it, but I said, okay, I'll write it. So I wrote some lyrics. I didn't know what to write. Actually, it was Lou Adler that said, just write a song about 007, about, James Bond. Just we had never seen the television show. So we wrote this song called Danger Man. Johnny Rivers recorded it as the theme song. And at the last minute, about 2 days before the show was going to air here for the first time, it was a British television show. They said they want to change the name of the show here from Danger Man to Secret Agent Man. So we went in, we changed that one line, there's no problem. And the song did very well for this one summer, and we forgot about it. It was only one verse and one chorus. And then a year later, they ran that show again during the summer. And one day, Johnny Rivers calls and said, hey, people keep requesting me to sing Secret Agent Man, and there's only one verse. What else do I sing? I said, well, look, if you'll record it as a single or put it on the B-side of your next record, I'll write a second and third verse for you. He said, do it. So we didn't know it would ever be a hit, and it turned out to be, the biggest hit we ever had. It was a #1 record. So you never know with these things. So everyone in America is now, into the music. Motown is becoming this major factor in the world of rock and roll music. It was actually a great time. 1967 was the year that we were having that success. In 1966, there was a short time period where the Monkees became the best-selling group in the country. And then they were outselling the Beatles. The Beatles hadn't had a record for a while. And then at the end of 1966, the Beatles released a little something called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I can't even say it. And rock and roll music was never the same after that moment. That album seemed to take the nation by storm. As 1967 began, Sgt. Pepper became the anthem for what was called the Summer of Love. And it was the height of the what we call it, the flower power. Arty, progressive music seemed to be influencing the social fabric, the youth movement, and the naive sense that a new world, a better world was just about to dawn. And it was all going to be peace and love. Boy, were we wrong. The Summer of Love culminated in San Francisco. It had become a haven for the hippie lifestyle. Later that year, rock and roll had its first pop festival held in Monterey, California. The Monterey Pop Festival was a huge success, and it seemed to help make rock and roll. It changed rock and roll. It kind of turned it into an art form finally. In 1968, the war in Vietnam was escalating. All across the nation on college campuses, students were protesting, and in some instances even rioting. The civil rights movement suffered a major blow when we lost Martin Luther King. He was assassinated, and then that was followed by Robert Kennedy. It seemed like, all hope was going, or if not gone. What was also happening was that the drugs part of sex, drugs, and rock and roll was really starting to kill off so many of rock and roll's most promising artists. By the end of the 60s, rock music took a step back from its drug-fueled experiments, and it turned to more psychedelic sounds, less psychedelic sounds, and went kind of back to what rock and roll originally was. As it turned out, there was this big, thanks by the way, in part to bands like Creedence Clearwater Revival that became a very big rock band at that time. The decade culminated with the most important rock festival ever held in a place up in New York's Catskill Mountains called Woodstock. And it was estimated that 200,000 people would show up for this 3-day event that would present most of the greatest of the rock artists of the day. As it turned out, about 500,000 people attended the event, and amazingly, despite the shortage of food, water, bathrooms, and a torrential downpour, Woodstock turned out to be, as advertised, 3 days of peace and music. It was a fitting end to the second decade of rock and roll. So here are some of those highlights.
This is where the youthful movies were being made. Everybody wanted to be a surfer, whether you were white or black or lived in the middle of the desert. You had to want to have a surfboard. It was crazy. And along with that came young music, and it was created here.
Early in the new year, and you're going to top the bill on the Ed Sullivan Coast to Coast show. John, so far, all British pop stars have not made a tremendous impact on the States. How do you think you're going to fare?
Well, I can't really say, can I? I mean, is it up to me? No. I mean, I just hope we go all right.
The Beatles are coming. They got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so finally we got to the point where they landed at the airport in New York, and there was like 50,000 people there.
Giants that came out of Britain in the 60s were the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, and the Rolling Stones.
Most of America's record buyers didn't go looking for black records since they had hardly ever heard the real thing. But by the end of the summer of 1964, most of the teenagers were dancing in the street, and they wanted Martha and the Vandellas singing it to them. At least that's the way it was on American Bandstand.
She said, just because you become a young man, there's still some things that you don't understand. Before you ask some girl for
right about civil rights. We were right in that love is better than hate. We were right in that peace is better than war. It turns out, weren't right about drugs.
The free sexuality was an interesting experiment, and it failed.
But when I think about the 60s, I think of the anti-war movement.
So the 60s come to an end with Woodstock. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that this class would be a very eclectic look at popular music, here's the reason why. Even though the 50s and the 60s were considered to be the years when rock and roll became the dominant genre of music in the world, Broadway was still going through, or was going through, what they were calling the golden age. Top 40 radio stations were never inclined to play songs from Broadway shows, and yet some of the biggest hits during those years, especially through the 50s, came basically from the Great White Wave, came from Broadway. I grew up in New York and saw Broadway shows. I'm what Stephen Sondheim calls a Broadway baby. I love the music from Broadway shows. And even though it wasn't a lot of it around, there were some that became so popular, some of the songs, that it was amazing. You know, the era came to an end, 1964, the Broadway era, when the British arrived, the Beatles and whatever. Although 1964 was the year that Louis Armstrong, he had a recording of Hello Dolly, and that song was the first song to knock the Beatles out of the #1 position after they had landed. And their records were #1 for like 2 months. So it took a song from a musical to knock them off. Later on that year, even Barbra Streisand's recording of People became a smash hit. And if you remember the early Beatles albums, on one of their first albums, I think it was their first album, they recorded a song from The Music Man called Till There Was You. That was from a Broadway show. So Broadway aficionados will tell you that the golden age began in the 50s, when so many of the shows began to follow Rodgers and Hammerstein's format of the integrated musical. That's where the songs and even the dance numbers kind of move the story plot along, or they deal with character. There were reasons for those songs to be in those shows, as opposed to the earlier days when songs were just put into shows to hopefully be hits, because the shows were more like reviews. So anyway, there were quite a few standards that happened during this period of time, and because I do these courses on the Great American Songbook and on Broadway, I thought I'd just include a few. Actually, the first big hit musical of the 50s opened on Broadway in the late 1949, and of course it was Rodgers and Hammerstein. They were searching for a follow-up for their previous hit musical, which was Carousel, which was a follow-up to their first hit musical together, which was Oklahoma. 1949, the war was still fresh in everyone's mind, and to most people, a show about heroism, discrimination, insubordination, and death in battle didn't initially appear to be a subject matter for a Broadway musical. However, in the accomplished hands of Rodgers and Hammerstein, the show called South Pacific became the first smash of the decade, and it began what many people think was Broadway's golden age. For me, one of the most interesting stories of the 50s involved two big hit shows, and by two unknown songwriters. The songwriters' names, and you probably never heard of them, were Richard Adler and Jerry Ross. Originally, Frank Lesser, who wrote both words and music for Guys and Dolls and so many shows, he was asked to write the score for a new show that was going to go on Broadway called The Pajama Game. And at the time, Lesser was already working on another show, I think that he was going to do, called The Most Happy Fella. So he said, look, I've got these two young songwriters that I've signed to my publishing company, and I've been mentoring. I think they would be great to write this show. So the director of The Pajama Game was George Abbott, a great director. He agreed to let this young team of Adler and Ross write the score. Frank Lesser kind of, I think, oversaw what they were doing. Anyway, this show became one of the biggest hit shows on Broadway. It won the Tony Award that year. Some of the hit songs that they wrote for that show were Hey There, Hernando's Hideaway, Steam Heat, just one hit song after another from this show. A year later, that same group of people did another show. This one was called Damn Yankees, and once again, Adler and Ross wrote the brilliant score filled with more hit songs. The tragedy of it all was that Jerry Ross, who was only about 31 or 32 at the time, they were never able to write that third show because he died suddenly of, no one was quite sure what it was. He just had pneumonia and he died at a very young age. Many people thought that they would be the next Rodgers and Hammerstein. Unfortunately, we'll never get to know because there was never a third show, but those two were just great. Some of the other hit shows, real quickly, of the golden era, delivered #1 hit songs. Bells Are Ringing in 1955, My Fair Lady in 1956. 1957, two hit shows produced some pretty good songs. One was called West Side Story, and the other one was called The Music Man. And believe it or not, The Music Man won the award that year. That was the bigger of the shows, even though West Side Story, well, they're both classics. The good thing about Top 40 radio back then was that they would play songs that were hits, no matter what genre they might be, as long as they were getting played or selling records. So many Top 40 stations who didn't like playing those Broadway songs, but if they were selling well enough, they would do it. The 60s brought us shows like Camelot, Bye Bye Birdie, but as I've said, by the time the British invasion happened, it seemed like Broadway's golden age was kind of winding down. But there were still some good songs. There were still some songs that became hits. It kind of went out with a bang. Hello, Dolly, Funny Girl, and Fiddler on the Roof all had songs being played on the radio, along with the Beatles in 1964. So for those of you that are not thrilled with rock and roll but like Broadway, this is for you.
I'm as corny as Kansas in August. I'm as normal as blueberry pie. No more a smart little girl with no heart. I have found me a wonderful guy. I am in the conventional dither with the conventional star in my eye. And you will note there's a lump in my throat when I speak of that wonderful guy.
Take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise, all lost in a wonderland, a stranger in paradise. Hey there, you with the stars in your eyes, love never made a fool of you. You used to be too wise.
You gotta have heart. All you really need is heart. When the odds are saying you'll never win, that's when the grin should start. You gotta have hope. Mustn't sit around and mope. Nothing's half as bad as it may appear. Wait till next year and hope.
Just in time, I found you just in time. Before you came, my time was running low. I was lost, the losing dice were tossed. My bridges all were crossed, nowhere to go.
I could have danced all night. I could have danced all night and still have begged for more. I could have spread my wings and done 1,000 things I've never done before. There were bells on the hills, but I never heard them ringing. No, I never heard them at all till there was you. Tonight it all began tonight. I saw you and the world was alive. There's only you to make what you want, what you do, what you
In 1958, Rodgers and Hammerstein struck gold again with another collaboration, Flower Drum Song.
I have a brand new hairdo with my eyelashes all in curls. I float as the clouds song hairdo. I enjoy being a girl.
A dream that will need all the love you can give every day of your life for as long as you
Gray skies are gonna clear up, put on a happy face. Brush off the clouds and cheer up, put on a happy face. Take off the gloomy mask of tragedy, it's not your style. You look so good that you'll be glad you decided to smile.
If ever I would leave you, it wouldn't be in summer. Seeing you in summer, I never would go. Your hair streaked with sunlight, your lips red as flame, your face with a luster that puts gold to shame.
Hello, Harry. Well, hello, Louis. It's so nice to be back home where I belong. You're looking swell, Manny. I can tell, Danny. You're still glowing, you're still crowing, you're still
So, you know, it shows you that through all the years of music, how music changes, there's all these different genres, and great songs seem to always find a place, and they get to be heard, and if they're good enough, they get to be hits. As the 70s began, the music industry really had exploded now, so we're getting to the end. There were more new artists that would go on to become major stars in the 70s than the 50s and 60s combined. First of all, the 70s were filled with important moments for America and for the rest of the world, starting with technological innovations from the introduction of the floppy disk to the launch of Microsoft to the Sony Walkman to the VCR, all happening during the 70s. And for, nerds like myself, it was Star Wars. That was the big thing that happened in the 70s. In the music world, the term rock and roll had almost become meaningless. Rock and roll music over the course of the 50s and the 60s had morphed into hundreds of different types of music. Pop music had splintered into multitudes of styles. There seemed to be something for everybody. You had soft rock, which is now called yacht rock. You had hard rock, country rock, folk rock, punk rock, heavy metal, and of course R&B music that would eventually develop into dance music, and then funk music, and then disco, whatever. I mean, there was something for everybody. Record albums were selling now more than ever before, thanks because they were just not only record albums, but you had 8-tracks and cassettes that you could buy. And you had your choice of what you wanted to listen to in your car, even on your own personal Walkman. You didn't have to depend on what radio was playing anymore. Local record stores were now becoming more like discount supermarkets, places like Tower Records where you could spend an entire afternoon. In the 1970s, new bands seemed to come out of nowhere, and they became million-selling artists. These were bands that were championed by the latest media format presenting rock music, which was FM radio stations. And you had groups like Led Zeppelin, and then Iron Butterfly, and the Black Sabbath in Boston, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They were all having big hit albums without even having hit singles at that time. So that was thanks in part to FM radio stations. 70s also became the decade of the singer-songwriter. And some of the greatest artists that we've really ever known that emerged during that decade and some of them still around. Elton John was the #1 artist for the entire 70s. No one sold more records, was as consistent as Elton John during that decade. There were other artists like Cat Stevens and James Taylor and Gordon Lightfoot and Joni Mitchell and Neil Young. I do an entire course on the singer-songwriters of the 70s, as some of you may know. There were so many great ones. One of the earliest artists to make a major impact was a piano-playing singer-songwriter who had already written some of the biggest hits of the 60s, and that, of course, was Carole Klein from New York, Carole King. And like Carole, Neil Diamond was also a product of the bill-building era. 1971, Carole recorded the best-selling album, one of the best-selling albums at that time, was the best-selling album, I think, ever, the album Tapestry. During the latter part of the 70s, disco became a phenomenon. And like all other trends that happened, disco had its moment. The moment came in 1977 through 1978, lasted for no longer than a couple of years. Disco was more of a producer's vision, really, than an artist's vision of what a record should sound like. It was much more mechanical sounding, and in many instances, overproduced. And the use of the drum machine became the big thing, which a lot of us didn't like because, we liked the sound of real musicians playing on the records, but it worked great for the dance records. So there's no definitive date as to when dance music officially became disco music, but in 1977, that was the year that most people will point to because that was the year of Saturday Night Fever. And the movie was released, but if you remember, the movie wasn't really released until December 1977, and it didn't really take off and become a phenomenon until 1978. And of course, it made the Bee Gees the hottest act in the country once again, which they had been a couple times before. So looking back now at Elvis and the Beatles, the country seemed to reflect the mood of the music at that particular time. By 1974, the war in Vietnam had finally come to an end, and the mood of the country was, obviously more upbeat. People wanted to get out and dance. So in this case, I think what happened was that music was reflecting the mood of the country. However, by 1979, disco music had become a dirty word in the business. Everybody hated disco. As the decade of the 70s, as for the decade, it turned out to be the most profitable in the history of the music industry, not only because of its expanding record-buying audience, but all the new ways of exposing music to that audience. So many of the artists that emerged in the 70s are truly some of the best artists that the music industry has ever known. It's been over 100 years since Irving Berlin combined European melodies, sensibilities with African-American rhythms to create Alexander's Ragtime Band. It's been about 60 years since Bill Haley and the Comets came along and combined country swing. They were a country band before they had Rock Around the Clock. They combined country swing music with R&B rhythms to create Rock Around the Clock. And amazingly, so much of the music created since 1911 still remains popular today, because I think it's Michael Feinstein that said that, what makes a standard, he was once asked what time, he said, standard